President Joe Biden's latest budget proposal calls for more funding in many areas, including policing in America, defense, a lot of bad things, but also he's proposing funding for a lot of great things. The big takeaway here, though, is none of it is likely to happen, with the exception of additional defense spending. Let me give you the details. Now, Biden will request $813.3 billion in national security spending, and that's an increase of $31 billion or 4% from the 2022 budget, and that's according to people familiar with the proposal. Now, just to break it down a little further in regard to the proposal for defense funding, the funding for the Defense Department will also include $4.1 billion to conduct research and development defense capabilities. Okay, let's just pause for a second. We'll come back to this graphic. Do these private military contractors not have enough profit? Do they not have enough resources to conduct their own research and development? Like, why does the federal government, with the use of taxpayer money, need to give this to defense contractors to do their research and development? I mean, this is just a perfect example of how rigged this system is, thanks to legalized bribery. Defense contractors fund the politicians, and then the politicians give them all sorts of goodies, including funding for research and development. It's mind-blowing, but let me give you more details here. Nearly $5 billion for a space-based missile warning system to detect global threats, and nearly $2 billion for a missile defense interceptor to protect the United States against ballistic missile threats from states like North Korea and Iran. There's also some funding there for veterans, which I have absolutely no problem with. I think this makes a lot of sense. The White House will, for the first time, propose that Veterans Affairs medical funding be given its own discrete stream of funding. The administration plans to use the defense proposal to send a message to Congress that funding for veterans deserves the same sense of urgency as investments in national security. I would venture to say it deserves way more priority than the money that we typically provide for weapons development and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the budget has to pass. Some version of this will pass. So what will remain in the bill and what will be stripped out is the question. So all the defense spending will remain in the bill and maybe even be increased. Anything that helps corporations and donors will remain or be increased. There'll be a lot of talk about deficit reduction, but they will do as little of that as possible. It's always marketing. Not one person in Washington means it. No corporate Democrat means it, no Republican means it. It's just a talking point. So in terms of marketing, Biden's saying we're gonna reduce the deficit over 10 years by $1 trillion. No, he won't. And this one is not because he doesn't want to. He loves being a deficit hawk. That's kind of a Republican position overall. So he'd like to be right wing like that. But the problem is the only way to do it these days is to increase tax on the rich. So he included that in the proposal so he could have good marketing around that. Hey, I'm fighting the deficit, plus I'm gonna tax the rich, right? But those two things will not happen. There's no way in the world they're gonna happen. Not only is Manchin and Sinema opposed to it, Manchin says he loves his billionaires and those poor guys shouldn't get taxed. So that's obvious. And the only reason why it's not gonna happen, it's enormously popular, by the way. Almost everybody in America agrees to it. It only applies to people making above $100 million, okay? But the people making above $100 million or have assets of above 100 million, they're the ones with almost all of the power. So they're not gonna let their servants that are the senators and congressmen pass this, including their Democratic servants. By the way, speaking of which, top hostess, if you will, of the rich, Nancy Pelosi, also against it. She's made that clear in private conversations. Why? She's also spectacularly wealthy, and so are almost all of her donors. So what you're seeing, guys, is a lot of nonsense talk, and you'll see months of it from the mainstream media, pretending as if there's anything real happening in negotiations. But we can tell you ahead of time right now, the day that it is proposed, what will and won't be in it, and you will see that we are 100% right, because the only thing that dictates policy in Washington is corruption.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Cenk. I agree with you. In fact, look, to be fair, even Trump would come out with his annual budget proposal, and most of the items in there would never even make it into any legislation. The only thing he really accomplished during his stint was the $2 trillion in tax breaks for the rich. And so, to your point about how this is nothing more than like a PR stunt, it's not really gonna go anywhere, at least the more popular, important parts of his proposal. It's incredible because he's bragging about the wealth tax, right? And how it's going to increase revenue for the federal government. You said to the tune of $1 trillion over 10 years. Other estimates are far lower than that. So let me give you the details and then I'll get to the point I'm trying to make. So the budget will outline a minimum tax on billionaires, which would require that American households worth more than 100 million pay a rate of at least 20% on their income, as well as unrealized gains in the value of their liquid assets, such as stocks and bonds, which can accumulate value for years, but are taxed only when they're sold. So that wealth tax is expected to bring in $360 billion in revenue over 10 years. We know it's not gonna go anywhere. We know they're not gonna pass this. So if he's just doing this as a marketing thing, then why didn't he just say, I propose we reverse the Trump era tax cuts, which would raise $2 trillion in revenue over 10 years? You get what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
even the nonsense PR that he's doing is weak as hell.
Yeah, I hear you. So just to be clear, the tax increase portion of the budget would result in $360 billion extra into the American budget and reduce the deficit. The overall package, Biden's team says, would reduce the deficit by $1 trillion, the whole budget together, okay? So why not just say 2 trillion? There's a couple of reasons why. Their own donors won't allow Biden to do that. So for example, Biden says we're gonna bring the tax rate back to 28%. Well, it wasn't 28%, it was 35% before Trump and the Republicans and some Democrats implicitly cut it, right? So why not, to Anna's point, why not bring it back to 35%? Why not even try for 35%? You know you're not gonna pass it anyway, because his donors would be furious. And they would say, now remember, the most you could even pretend to do is 28%, and don't you dare say a nickel more than that, okay? So, and then of course he'll heal and he'll do as he's commanded. So, but guys, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. It's all theatrics. So the idea of that billionaire tax passing, even though it is massively popular in the country, about 3/4 of Americans want it, and we live in a so-called democracy, it has a 0% chance of passing. Zero, none. Any talk of it now is total nonsense. So do not, and how much credit do I give Biden for at least proposing it? Also zero, because he doesn't mean it. He's lying. He's not even gonna try to pass it. We've seen this movie before, and here's a guy who's giving him a ton of credit on foreign policy. I'm telling you, on domestic policy, it's nothing but a lie. They won't even bother trying.
Yes, and to your point about the overall proposal raising, $1 trillion in revenue, other proposals within this include a tax, just a 1% tax on corporate stock buybacks, which sounds all great and dandy. That will likely go nowhere, and even that proposal is weak compared to what we had in the country in terms of regulations previously. We did not allow companies to artificially inflate the value of their shares by buying their own stocks. And those regulations were loosened over the years. And now we have companies spending a whopping, just last year alone, $882 billion in corporate stock buybacks. And this year, they're expected to spend $1 trillion in corporate stock buybacks. And by the way, speaking of that number, $1 trillion, how soon before we see the defense budget balloon to $1 trillion? We're getting closer.
Yeah, so again, the corporate buyback provisions have a 0% chance of passing. And like one provision in there says that even if you do buybacks, executives cannot participate for 3 years. Corporate executives run this country completely and utterly. They're not gonna let you touch their own compensation. that's gonna get laughed out of the building by the bosses in Washington, who are those same corporate executives. And if you're a right winger or a left winger, you all know this. The only people who don't know it are the people who read the New York Times and watch CNN and MSNBC. They get brainwashed into thinking, oh, there's real drama here. Oh, the Democrats are trying so hard. Oh, golly gee, they're trying so hard to get accountability. No, there's no way they're gonna do that. New York Times had a hilarious description of this where they say, well, some executives, there's theories out there about how executives might be doing the buybacks because when they do, they sell their own stock and at a higher rate, but it's because it increases the value of their own stock prices. Oh, is there a theory about that? Okay, oh wow, what then? There's also a theory on gravity. Yeah, it's they're not, neither one of us actually fits the definition of what we colloquially think of as a theory. No, if you take a step off a building, you're gonna fall. Gravity is real. And corporate executives don't care a little bit about their compensation. They're obsessed with their compensation. Everything they do is to get a higher compensation. That's why they're doing hundreds of billions of dollars in stock buybacks. And there's no way in the world that their own servants, the politicians, are going to defy their masters. No, they will heal, they will get back in line. No good part of this bill will pass. Thanks for watching the Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.